Unlike labels, which merely display information, buttons are designed specifically for the user to interact with. They're one of the simplest ways for a user to provide input to your program. When the user clicks on a button, they expect something to happen. That means in addition to defining the look and feel of a button, our program will also need to define the action it will perform when pressed. I'll begin by importing the tkinter package by calling from tkinter import asterisk, and I'll also import the themed ttk module from tkinter import ttk. After that, I'll call the tk constructor method to create my top-level root window, and now I'm ready to begin creating buttons. I'll create a button by calling the themed ttk button constructor method, and notice button is spelled with a capital B. I'll pass in its parent, which is the first parameter as always, and then I'll also configure the property for the button called text. And I'm going to make this button say, click me. Now that I've created my button, I also need to use a geometry manager to add it to my window, so I'll call button.pack. You'll notice that this button is themed to look like the standard buttons in Windows 8, and that's because I used the TTK themed version of the button. If I had just used the button constructor without the TTK in front of it, it would use the original TK constructor to give the older style of button. The button currently doesn't do anything when I click on it, and a button that doesn't do anything isn't very useful in a user interface. So let's fix that. The first thing we'll need to do is create a function containing the code to execute when the button is pressed. I'll define a function here, and I'm going to call it callback. You can call the function whatever you want to, and my function will simply print clicked. Now that the function's been defined, we can configure the command property of the button to tell it to execute that button whenever the button is pressed. To do that, I'll use the button.config method on my button object, and I'll set the command property to the name of the function I want to execute. So I'm passing in the function name to the command property, and now when I click on my button, you'll see it's executing that callback function and printing out the text clicked. Now we'll cover event handling in much more detail in a later section of the course, but for now, the main thing you need to know is that to make a button functional, you need to specify this command property. Now that we've specified the command property, we can also programmatically simulate a button click by using the invoke method. So if I call the invoke method on my button object, it'll simulate a button click by calling that callback function and printing click, and then it returns a value of none from the invoke method. Now this can be useful if you need to execute a callback method from multiple places in your code, because you only need to configure it once, and that's when you're defining this button. Another useful set of methods for the TK button class are the state and end-state methods. Buttons, as well as many other TK widgets, have a state which determines whether they're active and can be used or are disabled and unusable. To set the state of a widget, use the state method to modify its disabled flag. I call button.state, and when using the state widget, I have to pass it in square brackets. I give it the string disabled, close square brackets, and close parentheses. So this call will disable the button, and you can see it's now grayed out, and if I click on it, nothing happens. It's not usable. If we want to check what the current state of a button is, we can do so by using the endState method. So if I call button.endState, I can pass in that state description, disabled, and this is effectively asking the question, is my button in this state? And it will return a value of true or false on whether or not it's disabled. So of course it's disabled, so the method returns true. To re-enable my button, I'll use that state method again, but this time I'll call it with the bang disabled flag. This is effectively saying set the state to not disabled. Close my square brackets, and now you can see it returned the previous state, and my button is now able to be clicked, so it's back to functioning. And if I wanted to check that it's in the usable, can't enter clicked as a command. If I want to check to see that it's in this non-disabled state, I can also do that with the endState method by calling endState, bang disabled. And you'll see that now it's checking, is this button in the state where it's not disabled? That of course is true now, and so it returns true. There are other states that are available for the button and for other widgets, such as active and focus. For a complete listing of the potential widget states, refer to the documentation for themed TK widgets at the tcl.tk website. The last thing I want to demonstrate about buttons is that their appearance can be configured using properties similar to what we learned about with the label widget. For example, I can add an image to the button. Now, as we saw with the label, before I add an image, I first need to create it using the photo image constructor. And I pass in the directory to the file with that image. I already have that saved to my clipboard. So this is that Python logo.gif we used in the label video. And now that I've created my logo object, I can use the config method on the button to set the image property to that logo. And I'll configure the compound property to be left. So this places the logo image to the left of the text. However, as you can see, this image is a bit too big for the button. So let me introduce you to another method of the photo image object that we can use to resize images within tkinter. The photo image object has a method called subsample, which I pass in two values, an x and y, and it'll use every xth and every yth pixel in each direction. So for example, if I passed in the values 5 and 5, it'll subsample and take every fifth pixel in the x direction and every fifth pixel in the y direction of that image and create a new photo image object here named small logo. So I'll do that, and then let me reconfigure my button to use the smaller logo. And there. Now that's a little more reasonable and looks like something you might actually see in a user interface. You'll be able to modify the look of the button even more using the style properties, which we'll learn about in the later section of the course.